I'm unwilling to deny the existence of free choice merely because I don't understand it. Because it looks to me like that's how people act, that's how they expect to be treated, and that societies that structure themselves in accordance with the idea that people have free choice actually work. Now that doesn't prove that there's free choice, but people have been arguing about that forever. But it looks to me, so those are two possible means of integration, and then I think what you're doing is feeding one or the other constantly. And I think you probably choose which one to feed. I think. That's how it feels that way to me as well. Like when I look at my own, maybe you're really aggravated with something. Maybe you're aggravated with your wife, or your child or something like that, and you're feeling kind of nasty, and maybe you even know that you're in the wrong. And an idea comes into your head. You think, I could say that. And you could say it, and you know what it would do. But then you pause and you think, would that make it better or worse? And then maybe you go to hell with it, which is quite the thing to say. I've got a little story about that in a minute. And then you say it, but you knew that you took the low road, right? And you know it. And then you're guilty about that and defensive, and that makes the fight way worse, because then there's no damn way you're going to admit that you actually did that. And so things do go to hell. And so here's an ugly little idea. So that's relevant to the question. So imagine you're playing around with cocaine. Now, I'm using cocaine because it's very addictive, but it's a very interesting chemical because it's a dopaminergic agonist. And what dopamine does is two things. It makes you feel like what you're doing is worthwhile, but it also, imagine that there's a bunch of neural circuits that are active, and then they get a hit of dopamine, or you do. And those neural circuits get a little bit more powerful. Okay, so it has a rewarding property, which is that it makes you feel like what you're doing is important. And it has a reinforcing property, which is it makes neural circuits grow. So now what that means is that whatever you were doing just before you took cocaine grows. Okay, so now imagine there's a bunch of different things that you do just before you take cocaine, but there's a string of decisions, and at one decision point is the same for all of those different occurrences. And that decision point is, because you're in trouble, and that decision point is, well, to hell with it. Okay, so then you think that each of the 200 times that you take cocaine, even though you do it in different places, but that one thought is there all the time, and that thing grows because you're reinforcing it, and it grows and it grows and it grows. And so now that's in you, that's part of you, and it's the thing that says to hell with it. Okay, so now, and maybe that's not such a good thing to grow inside your brain. So then you're addicted, and they take you to a cocaine treatment center, and after a week you're no longer physiologically addicted. You're not craving, you don't have a problem, as long as you're there. But then they take you back to your normal environment, and you see, like, Cocaine Joe, your friend, and as soon as you see him, up that thing comes, and bang, you're back on the to hell with it track. And that's where you will end up too, if you reinforce that particular perspective long enough. So that's akin in a sense to this decision-making process. If you take the low road, then that wins, and it gets a little stronger. Because everything that wins neurologically gets a little stronger. It's like a Darwinian competition. So one rule is don't practice what you don't want to become, because you really do become that. It builds itself right into your neural architecture. And that's one of the terrifying things about addiction, because you think, well, it's kind of psychological. It's like, yeah, kind of. It's also kind of neurophysiological, and you build a one-eyed cocaine monster in your head if you hit yourself enough with something that reinforcing. Well, there's this idea in the Old Testament that your sins might be visited unto your family 7 generations down. Seems kind of harsh. But, when you're confronting, maybe your father's tyrannical. Yeah, but, maybe his father beat the hell out of him. And maybe his father's father was a vicious alcoholic. And you just bloody well don't know how far back that goes. And that means also you don't exactly know what you're dealing with. Right? To some degree you're dealing with your father, but only partly. What you're dealing with is the pathological paternal spirit, something like that. And it's better to think about that way because it becomes an existential issue at that point. So you could say that, well, the father has two components, and I mean this psychologically speaking. There's the great father that's beneficial and protective, and that organizes society and teaches you how to speak and has produced all these wonderful things. And then there's the tyrannical, oppressive part of the father. Just like there's the terrible part of Mother Nature that's destructive, and the benevolent part of Mother Nature that's wonderful and productive. And you're stuck with that, right? You're stuck with having to mediate between those opposing forces, just like you're stuck with the adversarial part of yourself and the heroic part of yourself. And it's up to you to set those things right. Otherwise, they propagate into the future. And it isn't a straightforward thing to say how to set them right. There's quite a good movie about that. Magnolia, which I really love. It's by Paul Anderson, if I remember correctly. I hope that's right. It's a beautiful movie. And it's about this, part of it's about this kid whose father's really pushing him to be a superstar at a quiz show, right? He's a genius kid, eh? And the kid studies this guy named Charles Fort. You don't understand this movie if you don't know this, because you got to know about Charles Fort to understand Magnolia. Charles Fort was this weird old guy who got rich with an inheritance when he was like 20 and spent the rest of his life in libraries looking up impossible things and documenting them. Impossible things that couldn't happen from a scientific perspective, that were well attested to by multiple observers. And he produced this newspaper called the Fortean Times, which still runs. Anyways, in Magnolia begins with this guy who falls out of a building and then is shot by a woman who misses her husband with a rifle as he falls. And I think she's charged with murder. And the street names have something to do with the deaths and his fall, and all of that happened. And then in the movie, there's a rain of frogs. And there are rains of frogs from time to time. Sometimes they're frozen. Sometimes they're rains of fish. Sometimes they're frozen. It's like, what the hell? How does that happen? It happens quite frequently, as it turns out. There's a rain of frogs in the movie Magnolia. And this little kid, see, what happened to him is that he's on stage, and he ends up peeing his pants because of the pressure, basically, and humiliates himself. And then there's this rain of frogs, which he kind of takes as a sign from God. And then he goes to his father, even he's like 8 years old, this kid, and he says, you have to stop doing this to me. And he's dead serious about it, very careful, not being, what would you call it, insubordinate, nothing like that. He decides that that's coming to an end right now. And you have to make those decisions in your family, because otherwise things propagate down the generations, right? And every family is rife with pathologies of one form or another. And you can learn from that and refuse to push it forward. And that's part of, I think, what you do when you shoulder your existential burden, because everyone is the beneficiary and the victim of the tyrannical father, just like everyone is the beneficiary and the victim of Mother Nature and of themselves. And so you lock horns with that and straighten it out one way or another, and you don't move it forward to the next generation. And maybe you detach it a bit from your parents too, because God only knows what combination of catastrophes culminated in their particular forms of pathology. One of the things that I learned while I was going through this was the meaning of the name Israel, because Jacob eventually gets named Israel. And I'm jumping ahead a little bit to the next lecture, but Israel, and so he's also the father of Israel and the father of the 12 sons who make up the 12 tribes of Israel. But what Israel means is he who struggles with God. And that's such an interesting idea, because it's, again, a psychological idea. And that's why I said earlier that it isn't obvious in the Old Testament what it means to believe in God, because what Jacob does is struggle with God. And I think that that's a really good characterization of an ethical life, because if you're trying to lead an ethical life, that's what you're doing, is you're struggling. Like, blind belief isn't helpful because you don't know what you're believing in. Like, it's just not that helpful. But if you're possessed by the desire to orient yourself properly, but also confused by the existential structure of the world, which we all are, then then what you're doing when you're trying to orient yourself properly in life is struggling ethically. And Jacob actually gets quite hurt. He wrestles with God, literally, and God dislocates his thigh. And so, the idea there is watch the hell out, right? The thing that you're contending with is powerful, although you can contend with it. That's the thing that's so interesting. But, you do it at some genuine peril, which I think is exactly right. But the idea that Israel, so there's Israel, the state, let's say, and Israel, the promised land, and all of that. But there's this more important idea, which is, again, a psychological idea, which is the state of Israel, which is the promised land, is the state that everyone who wrestles with God exists in. And that's not happy, naive belief in, an eternally blessed afterlife. It's not that. It's not a wish fulfillment. It's to be actively engaged in life, in the difficulties of life, right? And trying to find the path. Because that's what wrestling with God is trying to find the path. And that seems to me what belief means fundamentally in the Old Testament, perhaps in the New Testament as well, is that belief is expressed in trying to find the path. And that's an ethical struggle, and it's a real struggle. It's the struggle of life. So as long as you're willing to engage in that struggle, then hypothetically you have the divine behind you. And so I believe that. I think that's true. Because the other thing I see is that the people who set things right so that the horrible forces of cosmic destruction don't do us in, the people who are trying to set things right are the ones that are struggling ethically. And that there is a redemptive element to that. And I don't think there's any way of being cynical about that.